Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to listeners who are joining us from all around the world. We're really glad that you're here for this important conversation. I'm Susan D'Agostino, Associate Editor at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and I'm focused on nuclear topics. I'm here with a really distinguished group of experts who are going to talk to us about whether the recent open source development about Chinese, the discovery of Chinese nuclear missile silos means that China is at work expanding its nuclear arsenal. So I want to first introduce our guests. So our first guest is Matt Korda. Matt is a senior research associate and project manager for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, where he, along with Hans Christensen, writes the Nuclear Notebook, which publishes here at the Bulletin, and we're really grateful for those contributions. Matt is also an associate researcher with the Nuclear Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Welcome, Matt.
Thanks so
Our
much.
next guest, great, thank you. Our next guest is Duyeon Kim. Duyeon is an adjunct senior fellow with the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security, where she specializes in the two Koreas, nuclear non-proliferation, East Asian relations, security, and negotiations. Duyeon is a frequent contributor to the Bulletin. Again, we're very grateful for her contributions, and also foreign affairs, foreign policy, CNN, BBC, and others. She's also quoted widely in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the Japan Times. Welcome, Duyeon. And finally, another one of our distinguished panelists is Tong Zhao. Tong is a senior fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, based in Beijing. His research focuses on strategic security issues, including nuclear weapons policy, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, missile defense, hypersonic weapons, and China's security and foreign policy. Tong is also the author of 2 books, including Narrowing the US-China Gap on Missile Defense, How to Help Forestall a Nuclear Arms Race. So thank you to our audience for joining us, and thank you to our experts for joining us as well. We're gonna just dive right into this conversation. So my first question actually is for Matt. You were actually, one of the experts who made this open source discovery. So I want you to paint a picture for us. What does, how did you do this open source research? What can you tell us about the moment that you made the discovery? How many silos, how many fields, what were you looking at, and how did this come to pass?
Sure, thanks so much. And thank you so much to you, Susan, and to Rachel and Holly as well for having me on and putting this really fantastic event together with such a great panel. So I'm really looking forward to it. So just, really briefly before we get into the discovery itself, when we analyze information about nuclear weapons, we're using, always a really wide variety of open sources, but the source that's changing, I would say at the most rapid pace, is commercial satellite imagery, which, to a large extent is kind of the driver of today's session. And we're now kind of at the point where significant improvements in commercial satellite technology, plus this proliferation of kind of high cadence, near daily imagery at this point, is now allowing independent researchers to analyze and report on military developments basically in real time. So this is a really significant change from, even just a few decades ago, when governments basically had, an somewhat exclusive monopoly on satellite imagery and could kind of unilaterally decide whether to disclose, particular images or discoveries to the public. And so, kind of to go into, China as an example, the methodology of how folks have been making disclosures has been pretty interesting, because it kind of demonstrates how some of this open source imagery has, how that analysis often builds on other people's analysis that has been made in the past. And so we can take China as a great example of this. So I have some quick slides to show just for folks to get a sense of the imagery. So Let me just make sure I've got the right thing open here. I do, good. So, over the past few years or so, several different open source researchers, including, Catherine Dill and Scott Lafoy, Decker Eveleth, and Hans Christensen at FS, had noted the modernization of missile silos and training areas across the country in a variety of different locations. And then in February 2021, Hans first wrote about the presence of these kind of inflatable air domes that you can see here, similar to those that are used for covering soccer pitches or tennis courts in the wintertime. I live in Canada. We have a lot of wintertime. It's like wintertime, like 11 months out of the year. We have a lot of inflatable domes like this. And so he noticed those at the Jilantai missile training area. And the connection between those domes and China's silo program was pretty visible, because you could see this kind of initial silo excavation. You could also see these trucks that were carrying these kind of telltale semicircle structures that would be used to create the actual silo walls. And then, a few months later, Decker Eveleth made this big initial discovery of a suspected silo field at Yumen, totaling 120 suspected silos. And kind of the major signature linking Yumen to China's missile silo program was the presence of those same inflatable air domes that Hans had previously found at Jilantai. And so by analyzing the Yumen field, we kind of got some additional signatures of how the silo basin concept could be operationalized, right? Because it gave us an idea of the deployment pattern, right? How spaced apart they would be, what kinds of supporting infrastructure we could see. And then so I used those same signatures to find a second suspected silo field at Hami in eastern Xinjiang, kind of working on the assumption that the terrain would be largely similar between silo fields, and kind of just a hunch that they wouldn't be that far away from each other in order to make things kind of logistically easier for the engineers. And so with these kind of examples, you can see, especially, as we go through the progression, you can sort of see how open source analysis of commercial satellite imagery often builds on other analyses that have been done, by other organizations, other experts, other individuals. And it's because each subsequent discovery often opens up new signatures that future analysts can use to identify still unknown sites. And so just kind of to wrap up, just in total, we're looking at indications of approximately 300 potential new silo sites across 3 distinct potential operational sites at Yumen, Hami, and then another one at Ordos, which was disclosed by a military research unit at Air University. And then in addition to that, the missile training area at Jilantai. That's kind of the, you can sort of get a sense of what's going on from there.
Great. No, that's extremely helpful. Thanks so much, Matt. So what I'm gathering is that it's not that there's this precise moment where you made the discovery and then it's all tied up in a bow. It's that you're watching this progression and that you're maybe making, drawing conclusions about that progression over time. I mean, you've stared at these developing, it sounds like. So do you, have an idea? Do you have a thesis about why China is building these silos?
Yeah, so, missile silos themselves aren't necessarily new for China, right? They've deployed kind of legacy systems in silos for decades. The new thing is kind of the scale that we're seeing right now. So, the decision to dramatically increase the number of deployed silos has probably not been caused by just a single issue, but more like a large combination of factors, which I think we'll kind of all get to jump in on and theorize on in a bit. But I'd say kind of a theme to point out is it's important to remember that Chinese planning is not just occupied with what the United States is doing, but also what Russia and increasingly what India is doing as well. So there's kind of this big, web of security dynamics that's going on. Yeah,
absolutely. So I want you to hold that thought. We're going to get back to that web. I want to, pivot over to Tong. You are actually in Beijing. And so what does this discovery look like from your perspective?
Well, thank you. Even though I'm in Beijing, doesn't really make much difference. People here also don't talk talk about it. The government has never confirmed or denied the reports, whereas the national media that are affiliated with the government, they have come out basically denying the revelations and saying and suggesting that they are not missile silos but windmills, and also against this increasingly hot, incentive political environment, people feel that everything is being securitized. It would be too sensitive to talk about anything, especially things that the government media have denied. So the experts, they don't discuss, we don't actually exchange ideas of our thoughts about what is going on. I think, but the Chinese not keeping it a secret in terms of its plan to modernize and maybe expand its nuclear capabilities. The Chinese paramount leader came out earlier this year and made a very unusual statement. It basically said to the world that China is going to accelerate the construction of advanced strategic deterrent capabilities. That's a very unprecedented statement from the most senior decision maker in China. And I think if people read the statement, they would know there must be lots of important projects going on, but people just don't know about the specifics. I think if we look at China's nuclear program, nuclear thinking for decades, China has been concerned about the impact of American nuclear policy, impact of American missile defense on the overall survivability and credibility of China's small nuclear arsenal. So those concerns have been, existence for a long time. But if we look at what the US has been doing, there has been no radical change in American nuclear policy or American missile defense policy. So it would be hard to argue that this is directly linked to changes in recent American security policy. Personally, I think, and this is also publicly argued by many popular public opinion leaders in China, who argue that because of this growing strategic hostility from the United States against China in recent years, China has to have a greater nuclear arsenal simply to make sure that the US has no doubt about Chinese resolve to defend its core interests. The view is the US has been more hostile against China because the US has been trying to undermine China's political stability, trying to overthrow the political regime by raising issues over human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, democracy, etc. So those disputes between the two sides are viewed as the strongest evidence that US no longer wants to live peacefully together with China under its current political system. So I think that's a very important new driver of China's nuclear modernization. And people start to argue openly that, because US has been more hostile, a small Chinese arsenal can no longer contain the American hostility. A larger arsenal needs to make sure there's zero doubt in the mind of American decision makers that there is no way, the US can do anything fundamentally contradicting Chinese interests, and to ensure that the bilateral relationship doesn't go into the worst place. I think if that's the real Chinese thinking, and we also need to remember that in recent years, international observers have argued that China's political system, China's decision-making system has become increasingly centralized under one person. And if China's paramount leader embraces that view, he can, single-handedly change China's traditional nuclear policy. And I think we need to take that into consideration as well. And if we look at the things at the practical level, people ask questions why China is building silos. At technical level, things might make sense. Silo can be hardened. They can be concentrated so that China can deploy missile defense to protect them more effectively. And silos provide more reliable command control system for Chinese nuclear forces. And also it's not just the silos. I think China is also making sure it is adding more road mobile ICBMs, more nuclear submarines, and even introducing an air deck of nuclear forces. So it's comprehensive nuclear modernization.
Okay, great. So I want to get to Duyeon, but I also want to ask one follow-up question. So if a significant motivating factor is a response to the US aggression, for lack of a better word, do you think that the motivation is primarily to use as a future negotiating card in talks, or is it actually legitimately trying to build up its strike capacity?
I think given the overwhelming thinking domestically that China needs a greater strategic capability to contain American strategic hostility, I think at least for the foreseeable future, the interest would be in to simply enhance China's capabilities.
Okay.
And maybe after China becomes more confident about its deterrent in the new geopolitical environment, China might start thinking about potential areas for arms control cooperation. But I think that would be somewhere down the road.
Okay. Okay, great. So I want to come back to you, but I also want to ask Duyeon. So you're in South Korea right now. So I'm curious about how this development is perceived in South Korea and also just generally in the region. If you could comment on that.
Well, thanks, Susan and the Bulletin, for another timely and excellent discussion with my two brilliant colleagues today. Even here in South Korea, it's not like, and this has nothing to do with Matt's findings, but it's not like this has erupted a huge public debate or lots of headlines and fury and panic or anything like that. Interestingly, I actually had to go out and ask my colleagues in the policy community and the national security establishment to see how they view the issue. And so I think that's telling for a couple reasons, but I got varied reactions. One, in no particular order, is a reaction was, we know China has nuclear weapons. They're part of the P5. What's a few more going to make a difference? And another reaction was, well, they must be aimed at the United States. But there are other security specialists and experts and those working these issues who are very concerned. It may not be public knowledge. They may not voice it publicly. But they are concerned because they, and of course, colleagues in Japan, perhaps even in Taiwan even, we've heard the Japanese defense minister recently asked the European Union to help deter China. And so they're seeing this as yet another data point or evidence of what they think is China's quest or objective to continue to build up and modernize across the board, especially in the nuclear front, but of course on the conventional front too. And so not only do they see this in the context of the nuclear buildup and modernization, but also in the context, the geopolitical context of wanting to dominate this part of the region, for wanting to throw its weight around in the region, for increasing leverage, and for dominating the science and tech space, especially in the context of its strategic competition with the United States. And that's the lens in which a lot of my colleagues have been seeing this. And I think that's, I actually agree with that lens too. And so, along with all that is, well, then, of course, I think about what happens to us, meaning America's allies and partners in the region. And that's when there are reactions of, and we can expect this to happen is as we get closer, as the United States gets closer to finalizing its nuclear posture review, and I know we'll talk about implications later on in the next section. I think American allies and partners in the region will want further assurance from the United States and want further assurance of America's commitment to them. America's security commitment to them. But also, other reactions that I've heard, and these are quite valid, is the whole question about the whole capability intention question. And even though, I don't, and many of us on the outside don't know with 100% certainty about why China is doing this. Of course, we can make lots of educated guesses or educated assessments based on data and official statements and precedent. But this whole question of whether the capability equals intention, or whether there are these gray areas that we don't know about, or whether, and I guess we'll go into more about whether this is just a shell game or not, all of this is feeding into uncertainty among thinkers and strategists here in the region, and again wanting both more deterrence from the United States and more reassurance or assurance from the United States.
Great, you actually packed a lot in there. Thank you. So of the range of views that you gave us, many different understandings of what the intention might be, and you noted that you agreed with several of them. Are there any that you think you could cross off the list? Or do you think, yeah, all of the above is on the table as part, of the collection of motivations that China might have?
I think they're all plausible, and Matt has written an excellent piece in the Bulletin outlining some of those possible drivers. I know Tong has written a lot about this and thought about this too. But I think for a lot of colleagues here in the region, it's making them feel like this is yet another data point to their perception of this must be like another Cold War with the United States, between the United States and China. And of course, there are clear differences between the actual Cold War and what we're seeing right now with the US-China strategic competition. But in terms of the nuclear dimension and the potential for a nuclear arms race, and actually there are those who do believe we're already in a nuclear arms race right now, the biggest difference that we're seeing with the US-China strategic competition touches on all dimensions of the relationship and not just nuclear or military. And so, it raises the question of, if we, I know this is this question debate has been discussed to death almost, but, there are questions that are raised on when and will China ever go bankrupt and prefer talks instead, like the former Soviet Union. And at least among the people that I've talked to, their guess is probably not. And I agree with this because China has many more ways it can make money, including cyber, and crisis can come in from any number of sources, unlike during the Cold War, when we actually had some predictability that the crisis would come from the nuclear domain during the Cold War. And so this is just feeding and fueling concerns in the region among Asian countries, and of course against this backdrop of a rising China and a more assertive China.
Right. Okay. No, you've given us a lot there. And let me pivot over for a moment to Matt, because you mentioned his article in the Bulletin, which really gives a great deep dive into different motivations and understandings that experts have. But Matt, your paper or your article in the Bulletin, right there in the headline, is the statement that China's moving from a minimum deterrence posture to a medium deterrent posture. So I'm wondering if you can comment on this for our guests who may not have read it, although I recommend that everyone does read it after this event.
Sure, absolutely. So I guess it's important to start out by saying that every nuclear armed state says that they have only the minimum number of nuclear weapons that they need for their deterrence, no matter how many nuclear weapons that they actually have. And China, is no different in this regard, right? The government probably justifies, any increases, just like every other nuclear armed state, by saying that the threshold for what constitutes a quote unquote minimum deterrent has shifted in the context of other countries' nuclear modernization campaigns. That being said, China has also always emphasized that its nuclear posture was quite different than that of the United States and Russia, and that China would not be a player in an ongoing nuclear arms race. And so with that in mind, the scale of the silo construction, which, as Tong mentioned, is also happening in the context of a really vast nuclear modernization campaign that involves, submarines, bombers, ballistic missiles, that would appear to be, in some conflict with these longstanding Chinese policies. And as Hans and I wrote in the article, if 200 to 300 nuclear weapons constituted a minimum deterrent, yesterday, how can 2 or 3 or 4 times that number constitute also a minimum deterrent, the next day? And kind of a related question to that is, if China did not change its nuclear force posture, would deterrence be any closer to failing? And if the answer is no, then it would sort of follow that China, like many other nuclear armed states, is going beyond what would constitute a strictly minimum deterrent.
Great. Yeah, no, this is, you make really good points about that definition that is moving, based on what appears to be convenient from the point of view of the country at the moment. Let me pivot over to Tong for a moment, because I know shortly we're going to open this up to audience questions, but I also want to talk about implications, international on the international scene. What does this mean, for example, for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or even the US Nuclear Posture Review, if you want to comment on one or the other of those?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, also connecting back to the first question, I think from the Chinese perspective, its goal doesn't change at the strategic level. We need to understand Chinese thinking first before we can understand its broader security implications. And here at the strategic level, I think China sees itself as still sticking to its traditional nuclear thinking and maybe even minimum nuclear deterrent. The only difference is maybe before China was like, for example, 90% confident about the credibility of its nuclear deterrent. But today, because China perceived the United States as being more hostile and being more willing to take sacrifice to contain China and confront China, China feels it needs to further raise its confidence level, maybe to 99%. I think that is the difference. It doesn't reflect a deliberate effort to fundamentally change the nature of Chinese nuclear strategy. I doubt China starts to contemplating nuclear warfighting strategy. But it's also, I think, relevant to consider the possibility that at the tactical level, China's nuclear thinking has evolved over time. For a long time, China's policy is to conduct massive retaliation, even against the smallest scale of a nuclear attack. I think that gradually doesn't make sense anymore to Chinese military strategists as they watch American and Russian debates about the importance of controlling escalation, etc. So maybe Chinese military strategists start to think to themselves, we also need to think about how do we respond to small-scale nuclear attack, right. And how do we think about escalation control. I think that's where the another piece, which is China is adding more theater-range nuclear forces into the picture. And if China also think in a similar way to American and Russian strategies, they would start to think, okay, if China can respond symmetrically at the lowest levels, then eventually the countries will climb up the rungs of the escalation ladder. Eventually becomes to which countries overall nuclear arsenal is bigger. I think this maybe more attention to these more detailed and nuclear deliberation is also driving China's interest in the larger nuclear arsenal. Overall, I'm not saying China wants to achieve a complete nuclear parity, but maybe Chinese experts think today that to further narrow the gap of the overall nuclear sizes is beneficial. The implication, I think, is primarily given that China doesn't I think wants to change the primary role of nuclear weapons. I don't think the implications are mostly at the nuclear level. I think the implications mostly relates to the stability-instability paradox. The Chinese goal is to use nuclear weapons to make sure the US wouldn't attack China with nuclear weapons under any conditions, including if China feels necessary to conduct conventional military operations in its neighborhood to secure its perceived national interests, including territorial disputes in South China Sea and maybe even Taiwan. I think international observers now worry, China may have a more ambitious goal to take a military action over Taiwan, and it may be so. And in that case, the Chinese goal of nuclear weapons is to make sure the US would never be able to intervene at nuclear level. So implication is, in theory, this could raise concerns in China's neighboring countries about conventional operations of Chinese military, and the nuclear weapons provide a cover and protection for these conventional operations. I think we need to have a more discussion on that conventional level, and maybe at a broader regional level, because it doesn't only relate to US, the big powers, but also, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, etc.
Right. Okay. No, you're offering excellent insight for our audience members, and I know they have a lot of questions. I want to ask Duyeon one more question before we open it up to audience questions. So Duyeon, we've had a lot of great insight from you and your colleagues. I'm going to ask a very hard question, but how does the world respond? How should the world respond? There's probably not a pat answer to that, but how can you at least get our thinking started in that direction?
It's increasingly challenging because we're seeing clearly the nuclear forces of both US and China are becoming increasingly entangled with one another as conventional forces become more capable and advanced and more strategic in character to some extent. So there really is less clarity going forward, and the chances of conventional crisis escalating to nuclear threats and conflict could happen sooner or quicker. And so I think that's whether it's on the conventional front, and I think Tong makes a really compelling argument that it's less concerned about the nuclear sphere, but more on the conventional. Well, that's where it could start. But the concern also then becomes, could it escalate into nuclear? And so this is where, you hear a lot of, there's been lots of debates and discussions on the need for arms control talks with China, but we all know that China doesn't want to. Because they believe that they don't have nuclear parity with the United States to engage in the types of arms control talks that the United States has with Russia. And Beijing has long believed that arms control talks are a trap by America. And so, and the other problem is there is no shared understanding about what arms control aims to do and what the value of arms control is. And so, I think as a first step, and this is not a novel idea, it's been tried before, and there are challenges here, but I agree with colleagues like David Zantora and others in that, we should think about the future of arms control beyond just the Cold War framework of just numbers. And to think of it in terms of course, risk reduction and crisis prevention or crisis management measures. Now here too, it's challenging to try to persuade Beijing to engage in these types of discussions, because I'm told that Beijing even sees, or the leadership sees, even crisis management or crisis prevention talks also as a trap by the United States. But of course, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue trying. I know it's been tried, and the Biden administration is trying to reach out on that front. But the other challenge is, in order to convince a state like China or other major power to engage in these types of talks, that country needs to also have the shared perceived, a shared perception of crisis or a looming crisis. And so, how do you convince that, it's not just the United States trying to impose upon China, but China should also be concerned about any types of miscalculation on the part of the United States in response to what China is doing. And so these are the types of discussions, at the very least, try to increase each other's understanding of each other's nuclear doctrine, strategy, each other's role, how each country sees the role of its nuclear weapons, and try to just have those types of discussions. And of course, it's again not a novel idea, but it's the constant communication that still needs to be taken place.
Okay, great. And I'm sorry, I want to, you're offering so much and it's great. I very much appreciate it. I want to make sure we get to some of the questions because we have a lot of questions in our Q&A list. So I'm going to pass it over to Haley. If you could give us a sense of what's out there, because we've got our guests here ready to answer.
Perfect. Thanks, Susan. Hello again. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner, and I'm the program manager here at the Bulletin. If you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please put it in the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. And when you are called on for a question to ask a question, you will receive a prompt on your screen to unmute yourself. Please accept that prompt and then ask your question. As a reminder, a recording of this program will be available on our website in the coming days. Now, let's move on to the first question. I see Scott Sagan has one, so over to you, Scott.
Well, I just wanted to ask Tong, but others could respond as well, whether the Chinese development of silo-based ICBMs suggests a interest in launch on warning capabilities, since presumably those silo-based ICBMs would be vulnerable to an American or Russian first strike. That's an unusual definition of no first use, to have launch on warning capabilities as part of it, but I haven't seen a discussion of that. Has that come out in any of the Chinese literature? And perhaps Duyeon or Matt could comment as well.
Well, thank you. I can start. There has been writings in by Chinese military experts, as discovered by foreign experts, that some Chinese military experts have been talking about launch on warning or launch under attack postures for a while, and they have argued that these postures do not violate China's no first use policy. So it's hard to tell how widespread this thinking is within China's overall nuclear decision-making circle, but that interest, that influence is clearly picking up. And we have a senior colonel recently retired from China's PLA rocket force, who publicly claimed last year that China had already acquired some capability of conducting launch on warning. I think as China, wants to further enhance the credibility and the survivability of its nuclear deterrent, there might be growing interest in thinking about new ways to do so, including putting nuclear weapons on a higher alert. U.S. government has said China has been putting a portion of its nuclear forces on higher alert even during peacetime, which is a departure from its traditional policy. There has even been discussions about Chinese military exercises involving launch on warning or launch under attack posture. So I think there is clearly a growing interest, but I wonder, maybe at the end of the day, China is really mostly interested in launch under attack rather than launch on warning, which is a less dangerous posture, but still, I think more destabilizing potentially compared with China's existing policy. But on the other hand, it may open up an opportunity for US, Russia, and China to look at this issue altogether. There has been interest in the United States about further reducing the risks associated with launch on warning posture, etc. So maybe the big powers can sit down and jointly examine these postures and maybe reach a common understanding that they all shouldn't pursue such postures.
Great, thanks so much. I think, Hallie, we're going to go to another question that you mentioned is ready to go.
Yes. So our next question is with Nomsa. And Nomsa, I'm sending you the unmute button now.
You can ask it for me. I'm in a weird place right now, and I'm afraid I'll get noise interruption.
Sure, I'm happy to.
Thank you.
So Nomsa's question is, based on Tong's analysis, if China is trying to assert its dominance in the region and to its neighbors, what is to stop said neighbors from feeling like they need nuclear weapons themselves?
So I don't know, Matt or Duyeon or Tong, if one of you feels like, gee, I'll take that.
Sure. I mean, clearly this is a big issue and question on the minds of Japanese colleagues and thinkers and strategists, more so than South Korean, but I would not rule out South Korea as well, just not as pronounced or at the front of their minds like it is for Japan. But that being said, at the same time, for South Korea, they're dealing with two countries, one right across their board, North Korea and China. And so whether it's because of North Korea, whether it's because of North Korea plus China, or whether it's because of China vis-a-vis, Japan, there are motivations, or there are trigger points that would tempt experts, at least on the expert level, to voice and to call on their government to contemplate exploring their own nuclear option. But I think here the biggest factor, or the biggest determining factor here, would be the credibility of the US extended deterrence. And if Japan and South Korea felt like the US nuclear umbrella was credible and reliable, then I think these voices would not grow as more than they have now so far. Now, I don't want to just only bring in North Korea here, but there is a like Matt was saying, a web. And so if both Japan and South Korea see both China and North Korea build up the nuclear arsenal, and they feel like US credibility has gone down, or they're not as reliable, then we can expect to see voices in both Japan and South Korea to grow. But as of yet, I would still say there's still minor voices. They're not mainstream yet, but they're there.
Great, thank you so much, Duyeon. Hallie's telling me that we have another question from Bob Einhorn.
Bob, your mic is unmuted for you. Sir, you have to accept the prompt, please.
Yeah, my question was in the chat, and I think Tong has answered it quite well already. I believe, and I think Tong has suggested this, that China seeks a mutual nuclear deterrence relationship with the United States. It doesn't want the U.S. to have the ability to engage in nuclear coercion against China, but I think it's doing that to establish this nuclear deterrence relationship in order to give itself a freer hand to pursue its regional objectives. And in support of those regional objectives, China is seeking conventional military superiority in the Western Pacific. So I see this as the overall motivation of China. And in the chat, I asked Tong to react to that, but I think he's done that quite well already.
Great, okay, thanks for your contribution. Hallie, did you want to ask for another question?
Yes, now we'll go to Hans Christensen for his question.
Yes, thank you. I shot a few of them in there, but I assume you were asking for the first one, right?
Yes, please.
Okay, so numbers aside, how do you see the modernization influencing or reflecting the Chinese leadership thinking about the role that China's nuclear weapons are supposed to serve? I mean, we've heard, of course, this question is, they're going to stay with minimum deterrence, no first use, launch on alert or under attack or whatever. What do the speakers think? What is the impression that they think the Chinese leadership is interested that the role of nuclear weapons should serve in the future? And here I just pinpoint a few things like simple retaliation, quicker reaction capability, more escalation control, regional versus intercontinental use options, et cetera, et cetera. You know how it is once you get more capabilities, then suddenly you can do more things with them. And what strikes me is that the way this is being reacted to, for example, from US military services, is very much sort of in a warfighting type of way. Is that what's sneaking in to the Chinese thinking? Of course, far from in the scale that we remembered from US Soviet times, but nonetheless, something that moves beyond this more simplistic form of nuclear deterrence. Thank you.
Great, Tong, did you want to take that question?
Yeah, I can jump in. It's of course it's impossible to know how the top leadership sees this. I can only speculate. I think from the political perspective, the paramount leader may think, again, faced with this new strategic level hostility, China has to have a bigger arsenal. I don't think he sees the role of China's nuclear arsenal changed or changing in any way. It's all still for the purpose of deterrence and not for warfighting. But of course, at the practical level, I think as Chinese strategists deliberate on response options, they need to consider how to respond to a regional nuclear attack. The US, some American experts have mentioned that the US might under growing pressure to use nuclear weapons first at a small scale in a future regional conventional conflict in the Asia-Pacific region, because China's conventional superiority is being established. So I think there must be Chinese thinking about how China can respond to a limited regional level nuclear attack. And then after that happens, how to manage escalation or how to ensure escalation would happen in a way that suits Chinese interest. And that, I think, is leading to greater interest in having a launch under attack capabilities. Rapid response has been emphasized by Chinese nuclear experts for many years as very important for the future development of Chinese nuclear forces. So I think that is clear. Delayed response, China would delay for days or even weeks before responding to a nuclear attack. I think that's past the time, and China is now thinking about how to projecting a posture of a rapid response would better contribute to deterrence and to escalation control.
Great, thank you so much, Tom. We're going to try to get to 2 more questions from our audience. So Hallie, if you want to invite the next audience member, that would be great.
Thank you. So our next question is a quick one from David Dodds.
Yeah, real quick, Hallie, before I ask that, before I ask my actual question, is there a reason I'm only seeing my own question? Like, I would have liked to seen the other questions and curiosities other people were asking. Like, are other people only seeing their own questions? Because there's my
for this
questions
program,
actually.
yes, sir, but we can change that for the next one. Would you ask your question, please?
Yeah, sorry. Okay, I was just wondering, it's freaking me out. Okay, I was just wondering what's the source of those open commercial satellite images that mostly from Matt.
Yeah, great question. So the ones that I showed are a mixture between Planet Labs, Sentinel, and I believe Maxar as well. So there's a few different companies that specialize in this, and some of them do kind of more high cadence, lower resolution imagery. Some tend to do less frequent but very high resolution imagery. So we can kind of use a mixture to identify different signatures.
Great, and if you check out Matt's article in the Bulletin, you'll actually see the sources listed under the captions of the photos. Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, one more question from Jin Ho Park.
Sorry.
We can hear you.
Yes. First question, Dr. Tong Zhao. Why do you think China, as the chairman of the Six Party Talks, has neglected North Korean nuclear weapons development? And second, Dr. Matt Korda, have you ever thought about North Korea's recent development of Boris missile using train platforms and China's missile silo construction are related? How do you think? And so, Dr. Tong Zhao, many liberal democracies have contributed to China's economic growth. But do you think the intention to build up nuclear weapon and nuclear force can escape international condemnation? How do you think about?
Thank you. I'll try to answer briefly. The last question first. I think we need to address this fundamental political level misperception here. China genuinely believes that it is under greater strategic hostility and containment from the United States. China genuinely thinks it's the United States and other Western countries that are causing all the troubles in recent years. So China is simply trying to defend and respond. I mean, I'm not defending the Chinese thing, but I think if we acknowledge, that's the Chinese thinking, then we have to get a handle on their widening perception gap at the geopolitical level. Short of that, I think would be very hard to contain this emerging nuclear arms race. I don't see a direct connection between Chinese and North Korean nuclear and missile modernization. I think North Korea is clearly trying to diversify and thus increase the overall survivability and credibility of its deterrent by making use of its unique geography, etc., resources. So it might make sense for North Korea to develop train-based ballistic missiles, road mobile ICBMs, etc. I don't think China has a well thought out strategy to address North Korea's nuclear issue in the long run. Of course, North Korea's development of both strategic and tactical nuclear weapons are of serious concern to China and could further raise regional tensions. But that's a much bigger problem that requires all the major powers to conduct better coordination and also to involve South Korea, Japan, etc. We need a political process to start as soon as possible. I don't think China has thought through how it can contribute to it, but I think a broader process, a political process, might be the best way to contain this emerging regional, not only North Korea, but also inter-Korean arms race competition as soon as possible.
Okay, great. So maybe we're running short on time. So Tong, maybe if you could just offer your concluding thoughts. I don't know if that was what you were also doing in answering the question, but I want to invite you, if you have any additional concluding thoughts, to offer them now.
Well, I think it would be great in ideal scenario. I think it would be best if all the states, heads of states of the major powers could sit down together and have a frank discussion about their emerging nuclear arms race. Because of the domestic political system as being so centralized, it really needs a blessing and support from the highest level to stimulate discussion and interest within the bureaucracy. If we want to see arms control cooperation we need that top level political support. But that doesn't mean there's nothing can be done at the practical level. We can always break down big challenges into smaller and near-term steps. China wants to discuss no first use. We can break it down into smaller issues, how to address credibility of no first use. Does specific capabilities, is specific capability consistent with no first use? Experts can start have those discussions in order to pave the ground for official level dialogues.
Great. Thank you so much. Matt, I want to invite you to just, give 1 or 2 minutes of your concluding thoughts as well.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, something that I would want to point out, and something that kind of stuck out to me recently, was something that the commander of U.S. Strategic Command said, after these disclosures were made public, and he said, it doesn't matter why China is modernizing, its forces in this way. What matters is, they're building up the capability to execute any, plausible nuclear employment strategy. In my opinion, I don't agree with the sentiment that it doesn't matter why these things are happening. I think, of course it matters why China is building, its nuclear posture in this way, because all arms races are built on this action-reaction dynamic, right? China isn't spending all of this money and all of this time to build out its forces in this way just on a whim, right? Something is driving China to do it, just like something drives every nuclear power to do the same. And we talked a little bit about what those factors could be today, but I think kind of not wanting to think about what the drivers could be of these decisions is the kind of thinking that I think only serves to exacerbate the arms race over the coming years. So I think we need to do our best to understand what's actually going on, so that we can be clear-eyed about how to reduce nuclear risks in the future. And that's why I think it's been so useful and great to get such a wide range of perspectives on this today on this great panel. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. Duyeon, I want to invite you to offer your concluding thoughts as well.
Well, thanks. For the sake of time, just very simply, I think we need to think of ways to manage the U.S.-China strategic competition. Again, I'm putting this in the lens or the frame of that, and reduce and find ways to reduce strategic deterrence failures. And second is, as we continue to assess and research and study China's trajectory, we need to try to prevent polarization that could complicate US policy, or that could complicate future agreements, or that could even complicate any future agreements that require a majority vote in the Senate.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone around the world who has joined us for this conversation. I also want to thank Matt, Tong, and Duyeon for sharing their expertise. And I want to let the audience know that this conversation will continue on the pages of the Bulletin. Join us. We have our free website, we have our premium magazine, and we will continue this conversation. So Haley, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks so much. Thank you, as Susan said, to Duyeon, to Matt, and to Tong for this dynamic conversation, and to Susan for shepherding us through it. Please save the date for our upcoming October 13 virtual program, What to Expect from the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference. More information will be available on our website in the coming days. And of course, please join us with your friends and colleagues for Conversations Before Midnight, our signature annual event happening on November 9. And last but not least, thank you to all of you for supporting the Bulletin and participating with us for the last hour. Ladies and gentlemen, we are adjourned.